This is the Linguistics Podcast. Questions or comments can be directed to Twitter at LinguistChris or via email to linguistchris@gmail.com. Hello and welcome to the Linguistics Podcast. My name is Chris, and today I want to talk about language processing, specifically processing preferences. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. As you know, I'm all about psycholinguistics, language processing, parsing, this kind of thing. And the particular theory that I'm going to mention today was one of the reasons that I got into linguistics, because I found it so fascinating. And so I felt maybe it was time to share it with all of you. Let me first talk a little bit more about what's meant by processing. So when I say processing in this episode, what I'm going to be referring to specifically is language comprehension, and specifically the generation of syntactic representations from a speech stream. So if you think about it, language is always, spoken language is transmitted from person to person through a stream of sounds. So if I say something like, John loves the cat, that particular stream of sounds is all that's come into your ear, John loves the cat. And there is some process that your mind uses to say, hey, okay, we've got a subject, that's John. There's this thing loves, that's a verb. And the object of that verb is the cat, and then John is the subject of that verb. That structure, that tree structure, if you want to think of it that way, so S going to a subject NP of John, a VP of loves the cat, at which the V and the NP are both daughters. That would be a basic syntactic tree for that structure. You have to generate that tree somehow. And obviously, the tree here is being used very loosely. There's some syntactic representation that lets you understand that sentence. You have to understand those relationships between the elements in order to understand what's being said. And the question is, how do you get from the speech stream to the syntactic representation, and then use the syntactic representation to give you semantic, information? That is, broadly speaking, that's what we mean by language processing. Specifically, turning a speech stream into a syntactic representation is known as parsing or sentence parsing. And so that is one of the things that is relevant here as well. There is a theory out there called the Performance Grammar Correspondence Hypothesis, a very long and lengthy name. And notice it's hypothesis, not theory, although you could argue that it is a theory because it is supported by a lot of the data that's out there. What's the point of it? Well, it was put forth by a guy named John Hawkins. He wrote several books about it. The two most notable ones, one was written in 1994 called A Performance Theory of Order and Constituency. But really the 2004 version is the better one, in my opinion. It's called Efficiency and Complexity in Grammars, and it's more concise, it's shorter, and it really explains in detail some processing preferences that can be inferred about the human processor based on typological patterns. Now, I know this is like, what? What's he talking about right now? So let me start with the basics. In syntax, there are certain elements which can be used to determine what type of constituent, so the category of the constituent that is being said. Okay? Think about, in English, you have a determiner, for example, the word the. So, the cat. Now, if I were to say the cat to you, as soon as I say the word the, you know that there has to be a noun phrase. Because in English, the only place that the word the can show up is at the beginning of a noun phrase and specify a position. So, the is suitable for figuring out that you're in a noun phrase. Now, normally, suitable elements like this would be called syntactic heads, but in fact, in a noun phrase, you have the noun as syntactic head. Some theories say that you can have a determiner phrase, a DP, which is in which the determiner is the head of the phrase. But in any event, it's all about figuring out categories of what's being said. Okay, so if you think about a left to right speech stream, if I say something like the cat, as soon as you hear the, you can say, oh, I'm in an NP. Then you hear something like loves. the cat loves. When you hit the loves, you say, oh, that loves, that's a verb. That can't be in a VP. Or, I'm sorry, that can't be in an NP. It has to be in a VP, right? So we know that we can't attach what has just been said into the same node that we posited with the cat. So as soon as we get to loves, we have to say, oh, there must be another syntactic node in this tree. Because remember, we're trying to build up this tree as we hear this sentence. Then you hear something like the dog. So the whole sentence would be cat loves the dog. You hear loves, you say, oh, I must be in a VP. Then you get another the. As soon as you hear that other the, you say, all right, there must be another NP. This must be the object. Based on English grammar, it has to be the object because English is very rigid about word order. And this makes a lot of sense, right? So, I mean, this is what we're talking about here is called bottom-up parsing, where you're taking the speech input stream and you're generating a tree based on these facts of the grammar that you sort of intrinsically know. So that's all well and good, right? And there's actually several principles at play here. One is called minimal attachment. One is called late closure. And they were both proposed by, I think they were originally proposed by Lynn Fraser in the late 70s, mid 80s. But these are principles for attaching and projecting nodes and doing all this. That we don't need to get into the nitty gritty of that to understand what's being said by Hawkins' theory. Instead, what we have to do is notice that if you look across the world's languages, you see certain trends with regards to the positioning of certain elements. And the positioning of one element that's important are these elements which can be used to determine a category of constituents. So let's, for sake of simplicity, let's call them syntactic heads. So let's say that a determiner is ahead of a DP, a verb is ahead of a verb phrase, a preposition is ahead of a prepositional phrase, and so on and so forth. One thing proposed by Hawkins is a principle called minimized domains. And what this principle says, I'm going to condense it down quite a bit. Basically, the end result of this principle is that you have syntactic heads bunched to either the left or the right of a phrase. Now, what do I mean by bunched? Well, that means that you have the minimal distance between them that you need. Now, English is actually a pretty good example of this bunching to the left. Okay, so if I say the cat, let's see, the cat of the house loves the dog. The cat of the house loves the dog. Actually, let's even simplify it even more. The cat loves the dog. If we think of each constituent, we have three constituents there that are of importance. One is the cat, one is the dog, and one is loves. In all three of those cases, well, loves obviously is just a single element, so it's equally bunched to the right or the left. But in the other two, both NPs have the head at the left. Okay? Now, if we say something like, I gave the book to Mary, then we notice we still have bunching to the left, right? We have I gave, and then in the VP we have the book, so the is on the left, to Mary. The to is on the left, both syntactic heads. Now is where it gets interesting. So let's say I want to say a sentence like, I gave the book that was really expensive and hard to find to Mary. Now that's one option to say that sentence. The other option is I gave to Mary the book that was really expensive and hard to find. And the prediction of minimized domains is that the second one is going to be preferred by the human processor. And you can kind of imagine this as you're hearing these. One should sound a little bit more weird than the other. So let me say them again. I gave to Mary the book that was really expensive and hard to find. I gave the book that was really expensive and hard to find to Mary. Now, in that case, the second one should be dispreferred. The first one should be preferred. Now, the degree of preference is going to be a function of the length of that NP. So if I expand it, so let's say I say something like, I gave to Mary the book that was really expensive and hard to find and took me 1,000,000 years to come up with. Versus, I gave the book that was really expensive and hard to find and took me 1,000,000 years to come up with to Mary. Now it's like, oh, clear preference for having the to Mary at the beginning. Why? Because the argument here is that the syntactic heads need to be optimally close to each other. So if I say, I gave to Mary the book when I hit the to in to marry, I know that I have a prepositional phrase. And then when I hit the in the book, I know that I have a noun phrase. And that's the last element I really need to worry about to get the verbal relation. So in terms of the verb phrase, those elements are right next to each other. Now, if I flip the order, so I put the to marry at the end, then the to is much further away because I have to wait for all this extra information in the noun phrase about the book to be said before I can figure out who I'm giving the book to. And give requires two objects, a direct one and an indirect one. So it's dispreferred, right? So this is what this actually is an explanation of a phenomenon described by Ross in his 1967 dissertation, which he called heavy NP shift. So when you have a heavier NP, you want to shift it to the end. Now, he described that phenomenon. He didn't describe why it happened. Minimized domains gives us a way to say, oh, here's why it's happening, because in this particular structure, everything we want syntactic heads to be bunched to the left. Right now, if we were talking about Japanese, then we'd be talking about the opposite situation. So another prediction of minimized domains is that you can shift them all to the right. So Japanese is a head final language, and it's pervasively head final. So you have things like case markers in Japanese, which are at the end of their constituents. You have postpositions, so therefore, again, on the right side of their constituents, and verbs come at the end of verb phrases. So you have what we would call left branching structures in Japanese, where everything is shifted to the right, and you have right branching structures in a language like English, where everything is shifted to the left. And when I'm saying everything is shifted, I'm saying syntactic heads are shifted to the left. So minimized domains predicts this kind of bunching to the left or to the right. Okay, so that's one processing principle that Hawkins suggests. Another one is called maximize online processing. This has to do with the fact that the language processor prefers to be able to assign as much information as possible to constituents as early as possible. Okay, so in practice, that means assign as much information as close to the left edge of a phrase as possible. Always to the left edge, right? Because that's the order in which things are presented. Now, for a language in which everything, syntactic heads are bunched to the left, this isn't a problem, right? So let's imagine a language like German that marks for case, even a language like English that doesn't mark for case. If I say, the cat loves the dog, when you get that first the on the cat, you know you're in an NP, and based on the rigid word order of English, you know that NP is the subject. So immediately you assign that information. When you hit loves, you know it's a verb, you put yourself in a verb phrase, no problem there. When you hit the dog, you know upon the presentation of the that you're in a noun phrase, and you know, based again on the rigid word order, that has to be the object. So there's no issue, right? You're assigning information as soon as you get it. Now, the question is, how does that work with a head final language? Okay, so if you're saying something like Taro-san ga, so Taro being the name of the subject, kuruma o, so kuruma is car, marked with an O, this is Japanese by the way, marked with an O, shows it to be the object. Katta, bought, right? The verb to buy in past tense. So Taro-san ga kuruma o katta. Now this is very, very interesting because notice that Japanese is very heavily a case marking language. It's marked the accusative object case on the car, and it's marked Taro with the subject case ga. Now, this is where this just blows my mind every time I think about this. Well, it doesn't blow my mind, but it blew my mind the first time I thought about it. Let me put it like that. Why does Japanese mark so heavily for case? Well, that's predicted by maximize online processing, right? Because let's imagine that Japanese didn't mark for case. We know that Japanese has a fairly free word order. So when you hear Taro-san, you would have no way of knowing is he subject or object. There might be a preference saying that he's subject because he's animate, but it wouldn't be a very strong preference, right? Because you can have an animate object as well. So we don't know what taro would be. Then we'd say taro-san, kuruma, car. Is car subject? Is car object? We don't know. Now, when we hear the verb, katta, then we know, okay, it must be that Taro bought the car. Right? That has to be the case. But without marking cases on Taro-san and on car, kuruma, we have no way of knowing what relation those two have to each other until we hear the verb. So we have to delay assigning information to those constituents until the very end of the sentence, because remember, in Japanese, the verb has to come at the end. It's head final. Right? It's pervasively head final. So, all of a sudden it's like, well, okay, then there should be a preference, if you're a head final language, to mark for case, because then you can get information about the constituents sooner. Right? So we have things like Taro-san ga marking the subject, kuruma o marking the object, katta. Taro-san ga kuruma o katta. Right? Now that's all well and good. Right? You think, well, okay, it works for Japanese, but what does that mean for the rest of the languages of the world? Well, as it turns out, it predicts some typological tendencies beautifully. The one I'm thinking about here is one proposed by Joseph Greenberg in his 1963 book chapter, and it goes like this: if in a language the verb follows both the nominal subject and nominal object as the dominant order, then the language almost always has a case system. What is this saying? This is saying that if your SOV, in other words, if you have the verb at the end, you almost always have a case system. You almost always mark for case. Now, what does that mean? Well, we know that having the verb at the end, you have at least one head final structure, and that would be the verb phrase. Something a little bit more interesting is that if you have the SOV order, you're more likely to have postpositions. Okay, it's another one of Greenberg's universals. It's a universal tendency. If you have SOV order, you're more likely to have postpositions. Now, what does that mean? Well, postpositions are another head final structure. Okay, so in those two universals, we find evidence for both the minimized domains principle and the maximized line processing principle. How? Well, if you have a verb final verb phrase, then you will prefer to have a head final adpositional phrase, so a postpositional phrase rather than a prepositional phrase. Why? Because you want to bunch all of the heads to the same side. Minimized domain says either bunch them all to the left or bunch them all to the right. So that's beautifully explains why we see that typological pattern. Next, if you have all of these things bunched to the right, so to the end of the phrase, as Japanese does, then you will have a very, very strong preference to mark for case. Why? Because maximize online processing says you want to have as much information as possible assigned as early as possible. So you want to mark these things for case if you're not going to be able to rely on things like the syntactic head to tell you what categories things are in. This is incredibly interesting to me. I mean, that just blew my mind the first time I heard it, like I said, because here's two observations about the world's languages and two principles about the kind of hardware that the languages are running on. So we're saying that the human processor, the mental method that works on the language, has these preferences and that they explain why we see the patterns that we see. So in a sense, we're saying that the language patterns, the cross-linguistic patterns of the world, are epiphenomenal to the thing that runs them, the cognition behind them that created them. That's an incredible, incredible thought to me. Now, very quickly, let me go over, let's see what time I have. So I'm almost at 20 minutes here. Let me go over a couple other items. Well, let me go over one other item that is of interest to this. So it's very interesting that this predicts, common types, but what about uncommon types? Well, actually, it gives us a very nice way to say why some languages are uncommon types. And that would be because they are actually non-optimal in terms of these processing preferences. And what's meant by that? Well, first let me say that there's no kind of social claim behind the non-optimality of a language. All that we're saying is that because of diachronic factors, so because of the way that the language developed over time, they may adhere to the processing principles more or less than other languages. So, for example, let's say that you have a pervasively head-initial language that comes in contact with a pervasively head-final language, and over time you end up with a language that is a mix of head-initial and head-final constituents. That's clearly dispreferred by minimized domains. There's probably other factors that have to come into play to make that language processable, if that's a word. Processable, I guess. Let's say it's a word. But regardless, when you go back to minimized domains, that language is still non-optimal according to that preference. Okay, now we're not saying anything about one language being better than another. We're just saying, well, according to this preference, it doesn't work, right? And one great example that this works on is so-called verb-second languages, V2 languages, which I think I've mentioned in the podcast before. These are languages like German. All the Germanic languages are verb-second of a kind. Kashmiri is the only non-Germanic language that I think has been documented as being verb-second. And that's it, right? So Germanic languages and Kashmiri. That's not a big group. We're talking about the thousands of languages in the world, and you say the handful of languages in the Germanic family and Kashmiri. That's a very rare type, verb second. And it begs a question, why is it so rare? Now, the verb second analysis is a beautiful analysis. It tells you all about how verb second works. You have to have some verb in second position in every not in every clause. In the main clause, you have to have some verb in second position, and all the other verbs will go to the end. If you have an auxiliary in second position, then the main verb goes to the end, so on and so forth. And there's specifics about what gets conjugated and what doesn't, what stays in infinitive. That is all well and good for describing the phenomenon, but what it doesn't do is tell us why it's rare. And this was a point made by Frederick Neumeier in a 2010 book, chapter that he wrote. Let's see, something about rare typological structures. I don't remember the title of the book, but in the chapter that he wrote for that, he talks about how with this very phenomenon, so verb second is not explained as being rare by the verb second analysis itself. We need something else to tell us why that language type is so rare. And in fact, minimized domains and maximized island processing does this for us. So going back to German, in the subordinate clause in German, you have very, very strict verb finality. Okay, so you have a head final verb phrase. Now, in the verb second analysis, this is the default verb phrase is head final, and you have a movement phenomenon that takes place for the main clause. That's all irrelevant here. What we're saying is, empirically speaking, we have a head final verb phrase in the German subordinate clause, but we still have things like prepositions. We still have determiners that sit at the left of their phrase. So we have a mix of head initial and head final elements. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that in a subordinate clause in German, you have non-optimal distances between verbs and their constituents. Okay, so you have things like der Mann die Katze liebt, not der Mann liebt die Katze. So in a main clause, der Mann liebt die Katze means the man loves the cat. In a subordinate clause, so you first have some kind of subordinator like das. You'd say, das der Mann die Katze liebt. That the man the cat loves. Okay, so the loves gets pushed all the way to the end. It's all the way at the end of the phrase, and you have der Mann die Katze liebt. Now, German makes up for this in a way by having some case marking. So der Mann, the der shows, yes, it has to be the subject of the clause, right? However, the case marking paradigm is incomplete. So in the feminine, for example, you have no difference between nominative and accusative. Likewise, in the neuter case, you have no difference between nominative and accusative case. So you could have something like dass die Frau die Katze liebt, that the woman the cat loves, and technically speaking, you would have no way, based on case marking alone, to determine whether it is the woman doing the loving or it is the cat doing the loving. Now, in practice, it's the woman doing the loving. Why? Because when you have that ambiguity in the case marking, then German has a rigid word order that takes over, especially in the subordinate clause. So in the subordinate clause, you have subjects coming first a vast majority of the time. You have a kind of rigidity there for subject first in the subordinate clause that you don't have in the main clause. And that's due primarily to the fact that, according to this theory, according to Hawkins' theory, that when you have the verb at the end, you get this non-optimal mix in the subordinate clause that you don't quite have in the main clause, because sometimes you get the verb in second position, which can give you SVO order, which is essentially bunching everything in terms of syntactic heads, bunching them all to the left. Now, I know that's a lot of information to give you guys in 25 minutes, but the point is this. The predictions of the performance grammar correspondence hypothesis, minimize domains, maximize online processing, show that a mix of head initial and head final structures in German is non-optimal. If these are actually preferences of the language processor, then this mix that's come about as a byproduct of language mixing over time and diachronic processes that have given us this mixture of structures is non-optimal to the processor. And for that reason, it is very rare, because it's not a preferred structure. You don't get that structure by just having processing preferences alone at play. You'd never come up with it. There has to be some other thing coming into play, language contact or something like that, some contact with perhaps a verb final language or something like that. Or the other way around. Maybe it started as verb final and then got contact with, a language which was more pervasively head initial. But in any event, the mix is non-optimal. That's why it's rare. And for the common types of languages around the world, as are indicated by Joseph Greenberg, also Matthew Dreyer, these are explained as the results of these two processing preferences being at play. Now, in fact, there's a third processing preference called minimize forms, roughly equivalent to things like Zipf's law, which says that shorter forms are always preferred. Right, so this would be more at the word level. Shorter words are always preferred to longer ones, and that explains why we humans like to shorten things a lot. So why people end up with nicknames, why we end up, economizing forms. If we have a really long word, we'll tend to make them phonetically simpler, so on and so forth. Right, these are the kind of things that Hawkins' theory is concerned with. And again, to me, it's absolutely fascinating. These are patterns that are explained in a sort of psychological way, with a psychological theory. That's what it is, essentially, a theory of cognition as to how the parser works, how the processor works. And we're saying that because it works this way, these are the patterns we see in language, and that is, it's a view from linguistics that is not all that common now. It's getting better, but one thing that it doesn't concern itself overly with is these sort of really complex theories about syntactic structure and things like this that are illuminating for one language but not for all languages. This is the work that Hawkins has done here, and other people as well, is really looking at language as a whole, around the world, and what kinds of things we can infer from the patterns we see. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. So I hope it's been interesting to you. Again, I apologize for having so much information. It is sort of a complex topic, but I felt like, with you guys out there having listened to this for a while, I thought I could give you guys a flavor of some of the things that I'm really interested in, right? The specifics of my particular subfield, in which I hope to contribute eventually. Although it is difficult, but it's certainly possible. So that's all I have for this episode. I want to thank you guys as always for listening. If you have have questions, comments, concerns, please email them to me, linguistchris@gmail.com, or Twitter @linguistchris. Thanks again.